Hello, fellow stampers. This is Yana Smakula for My Favorite Things. Welcome back for another video tutorial. In this video, I'll show you how to easily stamp 3 autumn cards using the My Favorite Things new Autumn Blessings stamp set. The cards we will be making are clean, simple to make, and perfect to send to a crafty friend or family member, or just to make for yourself during the fall season. Let's get started. I'm going to stamp several images from the Autumn Blessings stamp set in Copic marker-friendly ink that is also waterproof. So if you are used to using Memento ink for your Copic coloring, this ink will not work here as it will smear during the last step. So look for something that is also waterproof, like the My Favorite Things Extreme Black ink, for example. Stamp the images onto white cardstock. I'm using Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock as this is the paper I'm most used to color on with my Copic markers. I'm stamping 3 of each leaf and also 5 of the smaller leaves for the first card, which will be a fall wreath card. We need to do some coloring now. I'm going to use my Copic markers, just a handful of my go-to colors to color these leaves. Now, I will use the same colors of markers for all of the colorings in today's video. So take note of the colors or look in the video description if you'd like to use the same marker colors when coloring your images. To color the leaves red, I used R39, R35, and I also later used R24 and R22 as my lightest color. This combo gives really nice fall leaves. As I said, I'm going for simple coloring, going from dark to medium to light, and coming back to dark, medium, and light colors again to intensify my coloring and blend the colors some more. To color the leaves orange, I'm using Y15, YR15, and YR18. I'm being rather messy, and you can see my coloring goes outside the lines, but that is fine. I'll be able to clean it up later using a white pen. It is easier for me to clean up the bleeding with a white pen rather than be really careful and try and stay within the lines. In the past, when I was just starting to learn Copic markers, whenever my marker bled and went outside the line, I took it like the biggest disaster and always had to start my coloring over. These days, I'm much more flexible about my coloring, and if some bleeding happens, it's not the end of the world. To color the leaves green, I used YG01, YG03, and YG94. I also used a YG00, YG01, and YG03 for some other leaves on the other cards for a lighter green combo. To color the leaves yellow, I used Y11, Y15, and Y17 colors. These markers give really nice, pretty yellow color combo for fall. Now here's another green, lighter green combo in action, YG00, YG13, and YG25. Here I'm using that white pen I mentioned earlier to clean up my marker bleeding. The pen works perfectly over Copic markers, however, you do need to let the marker dry first, especially if you need to clean up red markers. If you color over red and the marker is still wet, the marker will actually seep into the pen and the pen line will turn pink. So let the marker dry before you clean up any bleeding. Next, I used coordinating dies and cut the leaves out in my Spellbinders Platinum 6 die cutting machine. I did that off camera to speed this video up. From here, I kind of struggled with this card as I wanted to make a fall wreath and stamp a sentiment in the middle of that wreath and have a really simple card. But by the time I finished the card, it just looked too simple, you know? I didn't like it. I didn't like the colors for the background that I had picked, and this card just wasn't sparking joy for me. I kept changing things up, but it still wasn't working for me. I also used a shimmer pen from Tonic Studios and added shimmer onto the leaves. This is where it is important to use that waterproof ink for your stamping, as these shimmer pens are water-based. Also, when I'm running out of liquid in my shimmer pens, which actually happened here, I would often refill the pens with tap water and give them another go. So you basically have shimmery water coming out of the pen, and it is important to use ink that is not going to run when the water hits it. Finally, to save this card, I went ahead and cut the wreath out. I tore the whole card apart and just cut the wreath out with scissors. I decided I wanted the wreath off to the side, and here I placed it onto a panel to figure out the sentiment placement for this new card I was making. I stamped a different sentiment, "Let's Get Cozy," in black ink using my mini MISTI stamping tool. I stamped this onto a white panel that measures 3 3/4 by 5 inches, and then I adhered the wreath onto the panel using glue. I like this off-center design a lot more. It is a lot more modern, I think, and trendier for sure. I cut the excess wreath off and foam mounted the panel onto A2 light gray card base. I also white heat embossed Happy Fall sentiment onto a piece of red cardstock. I cut that to a skinny strip and foam mounted onto the card. I made an angled cut at one end, and the other end of the strip went outside the top panel and onto the edge of the card. I also later added a few enamel dots in various shades of yellow and red. For my second card, I wanted to do some old good pattern stamping using a sentiment stamp. I picked a stamp that reads Autumn Blessings and stamped it at an angle using black ink onto a panel of white cardstock. I will later trim this panel to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. So the main sentiment was stamped in black, but for the rest of the sentiments and also the rest of the pattern, I picked a light gray ink. I switched to my larger MISTI tool to be able to stamp the pattern to accommodate having that stamp hang off the side, and then stamp the images one by one. I used a ruler. This is a MISTI ruler to help me align the sentiments every time I stamp them. That allowed me to check that the angle of the stamp that I was about to stamp was the same as the angle of the sentiment that was already stamped. I hope that's not too confusing. Basically, I used a ruler to help me stamp things. You can by all means eyeball this type of pattern, or you can draw pencil lines. That would be super helpful if you've never stamped a pattern like this. You can just erase the pencil lines later. For me, it was easier to eyeball it and use a ruler to double check the placement. You also don't really need to stamp a pattern like this using MISTI. It certainly is very helpful to use here, the MISTI tool. But pattern like this can be stamped using a clear block, especially a longer block would be perfect for this, and a block that has grid lines on it. Very helpful. I kept stamping until I had the entire panel filled with those sentiments. I love the font used here. It is so modern. I just adore it. Next, I stamped several leaves for this card using the same waterproof and Copic marker-friendly ink. I colored the images with Copic markers. I used the same colors that I've already mentioned, and I cut the leaves out with coordinating dies. The background sentiment pattern is going to catch all of the attention on this card, and the leaves will just add a perfect pop of color to this fall card. I used foam adhesive squares and foam mounted the leaves, scattering them on the background, and next I trimmed the panel to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. I foam mounted the panel onto A2 light gray card base and added several enamel dots in yellow and red. Just a few dots here and there, and that finished this card. For my last idea for today, I thought I would make a colorful background and scatter a few leaves around as if the leaves are falling and swirling in the wind. I pulled out my ink pads in various shades of yellow, orange, pink, and red colors, and I used my abstract ink background technique to create a background. This basically is a form of direct-to-paper ink application where you take the ink pad and swipe it on the paper to get the ink to transfer from the ink pad onto the surface you're working on. I swipe my ink pads in various directions, creating unique, one-of-a-kind inked background. You can ink blend a background using yellow, red, and orange inks if you like for a beautiful fall card. But I find this method of swiping the ink pads to work a lot easier and faster for me when creating backgrounds. I let my background sit for a few minutes to allow the ink to dry. You need to make sure to let the ink dry if you plan to do any sort of stamping over it, as if the ink is still wet and you stamp the sentiment on top of it, the sentiment might bleed and you'll end up messing the whole thing up. So once my background was dry, I took it to my mini MISTI and stamped a sentiment that reads, "Hello Fall, the best season of all." I actually did some stamp surgery to stamp this custom message, but it is easy to cut clear stamps apart as you can always put them back together the way they were. I also stamped, colored, and die cut a few more leaves, and now I'm foam mounting them in place using foam adhesive squares. I've already trimmed this panel to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. My plan was to also stamp the little, swirlies in between the leaves to mimic gusts of wind. The swirlies come from another stamp set, from the Hanging with My Gnomies set, also from My Favorite Things. If you don't have this set, or if you don't have images like the little swirlies in your stash, these swirlies are very easy to draw using a black pen. Just practice on a piece of scrap paper first, and you can add little swirlies in no time. So here is a look at all of the fall cards I have for you today, created with the My Favorite Things Autumn Blessings stamp set. I had a blast making these cards, and I hope you picked up a few tips and tricks in my video and will give these ideas a go yourself. If you do, you know the drill. Please share online and tag us on social media. We always love seeing what you guys are making. Subscribe now and do hit that bell icon not to miss any new card making tutorials. Thanks for watching. Love you guys. I'll see you next time.